Okay, welcome to Advanced Photography. My name is Zach Layton. I'm the creative director and founder of Reliant Creative. Today, we're going to be discussing some advanced photography principles and techniques. This course will be a little bit more technically driven than our Photography 101 course, but my goal is to give you guys practical skills that you can use in the field to become better storytellers. And so, although this is an advanced course, I'm hoping to avoid teaching things that are advanced but irrelevant. So I believe that we need to understand how to use our gear, but only as an extension of ourselves. So if we get too technically focused, the gear can start to become a barrier to the creative process. And that's what I want to help you guys avoid. So my hope is to give you skills that you need to be great photographers in the field, specifically in a ministry context, rather than technically advanced camera users who aren't able to create great images or great imagery. So with that goal in mind, let's get into the course. I shared this quote in our Photography 101 course. The best camera is the one you have with you. And so today we're going to be discussing techniques and skills that are most relevant to DSLR and mirrorless cameras. But some of what we'll discuss can and will apply to mobile device photography. So if you've only got access to a mobile device, there's still plenty of things that you can still learn in this course. And in fact, there are some mobile device apps that allow you to photograph in manual modes and shoot even raw files. And so if you only have access to a mobile device, you can still learn a lot from this course. So if you're interested in learning manual photography, some of the stuff we're going to talk about later, with your mobile device and gaining greater control over your gear, there are some great mobile apps out there that allow you to shoot in raw and in manual modes. So if you have a newer device, the native camera apps now are starting to allow raw capture and manual modes as well. So I'm not super familiar with various camera apps, depending on the kind of camera phone that you have. It's going to determine what apps you can use. But finding a good mobile app that allows raw capture and manual mode will be a great way to start learning the technical side of photography. So being able to see what happens to your exposure when you change ISO and shutter speed and aperture, being able to see that on the back of your phone screen is a great way to learn this process. So take advantage of apps like these. Okay, let's discuss technique real quick. I want to make sure that you guys understand how to hold your cameras so that we can create the best results. Any movement of the camera, especially with slower shutter speeds, can create blurry images. And so how we hold our camera is important. The first thing you're going to do is hold the camera with your left hand, holding the lens and kind of cradling the camera like this. We're not holding the lens like this, we're cradling it like this. If you've got a zoom lens, you're going to be controlling the zoom with your left hand like that. Your right hand grabs on the grip part of the camera, and that's going to control the shutter button and all the function buttons of the camera. And then for stability, we want our elbows, both of them tucked into our torso. That's going to create our first and second anchor points. Those are going to be where a lot of the stability comes from. And then the third anchor point is going to be the camera viewfinder up against our eye. So just like a tripod has 3 anchor points, we're creating 3 anchor points when we hold our camera like that. This is going to help you guys create more sharp images that are in more focus. We're going to decrease the amount of camera movement or camera shake when we hold our cameras like this. So just like in our Photography 101 class where we talked about holding our mobile devices the correct way, this is how we can hold our cameras to create the best results possible. Okay, so this is going to be the most technical part of this course. The exposure triangle was created to help photographers understand what is going on in your camera when you are shooting in manual mode. So before we get into it, I want to quickly explain why we would want to shoot in manual mode. Why wouldn't we want to simply put the camera in auto mode and start shooting? And the reason is that we want control over what is going on with our tools and our cameras are never going to be able to understand the type of images we are trying to create when they are in auto mode. So if you're trying to freeze motion or try to freeze action, when you're trying to create an image with a long exposure to show maybe a lot of movement in a photo, your camera is never going to understand those desires. So shooting in manual gives you the most creative freedom to tell the story the way you want to tell it. With that being said, let's explore the exposure triangle. If you remember back to our Photo 101 class, I said that without light, photography is impossible. So an image is made when light is exposed to your camera sensor. There are three elements that control the light and determine how it hits the sensor, creating your exposure. Those elements are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And we'll get into each of these individually, but at this point, you need to know that every time you change one of these three settings, you've got to make an adjustment to one of the other two settings in order to create a correct exposure. So if you change your shutter speed, you've got to change your ISO or your aperture by that same amount to counteract that change. So these three elements make up your exposure settings for every image that you're going to take, and they will always be dependent on the amount of light that you are working with in any given scene. So if you are in a bright, sunny setting, your exposure settings will be different than if you're indoors or under shade. Now notice the arrows in the middle that correspond to the word brighter. With every move of these settings, your exposure will either get brighter or darker depending on which direction you change your settings. So let's get into shutter speed specifically. All cameras have a shutter. The camera shutter blocks the sensor. So with a mirrorless camera and all your mobile device cameras, the sensor is a digital sensor. And with a DSLR, it's an actual physical mirror shutter that blocks the sensor. So when you take a picture with your camera, your shutter opens, it exposes light to the sensor, and then it closes to stop that light from hitting the sensor. Now, this generally happens very quickly. You'll notice the numbers towards the left there, 1/500th of a second. Shutter speeds can get up to 1/8000th of a second on some cameras, which is incredibly fast. And that is how cameras freeze even the fastest motion, like, for example, a race car traveling 200 miles an hour. So what is shutter speed? Shutter speed is simply how long or the length of time that the camera allows the light to hit the sensor. So the slower the shutter speed, the more motion blur you'll have. The faster the shutter speed, the more you'll be able to freeze motion. So as you increase the amount of time your exposure will get brighter, and as you decrease the amount of time that that light is hitting the sensor, as you make your shutter speed quicker, the darker your exposure will be. So let's look at some examples to demonstrate how this works. Notice the grain in the photo on the far left. That grain is frozen in midair, right? This was taken with a shutter speed of 1/800th of a second. So 1/800th of a second is pretty quick when it comes to shutter speeds. Light was exposed to the camera sensor for 1/800th of a second. And so the movement in this image was frozen right then in time. Now let's look at the second example. This was taken with a technique called camera panning. As this rickshaw driver rode by, I panned the image or moved the camera in the same direction and as close to the same speed as the rider as I could. So the result is a blurry image with a sharp and a clear subject, this rickshaw driver. This technique helps depict movement in an image, but notice how this was achieved, right? This image was shot with a relatively slow shutter speed of 1/25th of a second. The shutter was open long enough to expose the sensor to the light for a period of time that was long enough to make the image blur in every area except this rider. So because the camera was moving at the same speed or a similar speed as the rider is sharp in this image and everything else is blurred out because the shutter was open long enough to blur every element in the scene. So this last example here, this beach scene, this is a long exposure image. So the shutter was open and exposing the camera sensor to light for 4 seconds. And the reason I chose to use a long shutter speed was because I wanted the water to completely blur. And notice on the beach, on the sand, the water on the ground in this image, notice that it streaks across the beach in long sweeping white lines. The light was bouncing off the water. It was exposed to the camera sensor for 4 seconds. So the water in the scene had 4 seconds to move through this scene. Therefore, the movement of that water was captured because that light moved across that sensor for an extended period of time of 4 seconds. Now, generally speaking, a good rule to follow when you're photographing people is to never shoot with a shutter speed that is lower than the focal length of your lens. So remember, in your ministry context, you're most often going to be photographing people, right? So we want the people we photograph to be sharp. We want them in focus. Generally speaking, blurry images are bad images. So this image of the rickshaw driver, this is a rare exception. But even in this image, the subject is sharp and he's in focus. So our eyes are naturally drawn to that subject. But back to the rule. If you're shooting with a 100 millimeter lens, your shutter speed should not be lower than or slower than 1/100th of a second. As a general rule for myself, I like to try to avoid photographing people at less than 1/125th of a second, no matter what lens I'm using. And for zoom lenses, I try to go even higher or faster than that. I photograph almost exclusively without a tripod. So if you have a tripod, if you're using a tripod, there are exceptions, but you still have to deal with the movement of your subject, even if your camera is perfectly still, right? So I like to follow the 1/125th of a second rule when I'm photographing people, and I try my best not to take images of people with a shutter speed that is slower than 1/125th of a second. It's just a good rule to follow. Okay, if your shutter speed is the length of time that the light hits the sensor, aperture is the amount of light that hits the sensor, or the quantity or the volume of light that is allowed to hit the sensor. So as you open up your aperture with a smaller f-stop number, your exposure is going to be brighter. As you close down your aperture with a higher f-stop number, your exposure is going to be darker. So as the aperture gets smaller, the light going into that sensor is going to be less, and it's going to be a darker exposure. Aperture is the determining factor in the depth of field or the bokeh in an image. So low or large aperture lenses and images are what give your images that quote unquote blurry background look. So when it comes to camera gear, this is what sets expensive professional lenses apart from consumer or cheap lenses. Professional lenses have the potential for large apertures, and large or low apertures are what will give you images with that blurry background look that you see on that far right image there. So the blurry background you see in that image was not created with editing techniques. It was created because I was using a lens with a large aperture of f2.8. Now, if you look at the image in the far left, this image was taken with a small aperture. Everything from the foreground to the mountains and the clouds in the background are in focus. So high aperture or small apertures will allow a smaller amount of light to hit the sensor at any given time. And the result will be images that will have every element in that image in focus. So high aperture images are great for landscape photos. where you may want everything in the frame to be in focus. Now, this second image in this lineup was taken with an aperture of f8, which sits right in the middle of the aperture range. Unless you're using a zoom focal length, an aperture of f8 will generally create an image that is sharp throughout the entire image. So we'll discuss this image further in a couple slides, and I'll share why I chose f8 for this landscape image rather than something maybe a little bit higher than that would be expected for a landscape photo. And then this third image, as we discussed already, was taken with a low or a large aperture. Again, this is how I was able to achieve that blurred background look. Large aperture images are a great tool for separating your subject from the background, and you can draw your viewer's attention to your subject really well with a large aperture lens. Now, large aperture lenses are also incredibly expensive, and so there is a way to achieve this look without the use of a large aperture, but we'll discuss that in our lens compression and perspective section of this course later on. Your aperture is going to be the determining factor in your depth of field. So as we've discussed already, a larger aperture or a lower f-stop number is going to create a shallower depth of field, resulting in that blurry background look that we all love. Understanding how to achieve this look by properly understanding our gear and what settings to use will make our images better. And so I personally love images with a shallow depth of field. There's a depth to images like this that draws the viewer in, and it makes these styles of images so engaging. All right, let's discuss ISO. If shutter speed is the amount of time the light hits the sensor, and aperture is the amount of light hitting the sensor, then ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor to the light. Let me say that again. ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor to the light. So as you increase your ISO, you will increase your sensor's sensitivity to the light, and the exposure will be brighter. As you decrease your ISO, you will decrease your sensor's sensitivity to the light, and the exposure will be darker. And so as a general rule, I don't like to go above 1600 on my ISO. If you have fast lenses or lenses with a large aperture or a low f-stop number of 2.8 or 1.4 in that space, it should be easy to achieve images at less than a 1600 ISO, because those apertures are allowing so much light in. In most circumstances, it should be easy to achieve an ISO less than 1600. It is important to note that as cameras continue to get better, they are getting better at dealing with high ISO or noisy situations. So as new cameras come out, they're getting better at this. But ISOs above 1600 are generally going to create noise, which is a pixelated look because the image doesn't have enough light to work with, or the camera doesn't have enough light to work with. And so the camera is creating pixels, creating information within the photo because there's not enough information to work with from the light that exists. And so high ISO is creating pixels that don't actually exist. So in this first example on the far left, this image was shot in a dark classroom. I had to have an ISO of 1600, which is pretty high. In this second scene, right there in the middle, the ISO was at 400, and 400 was used because it was a kind of overcast day. So 400 ISO is a great spot to start in when you've got an overcast, maybe a little bit darker than a bright sunny day setting. And then the far right, we've got this scene with this woman walking with an ox. The ISO was set to 100 because that scene was such a bright, sunny scene that I needed a low ISO to cut down on the brightness. Now back to the exposure triangle. Put all of these three elements, all these three settings together, and you've got the exposure triangle, right? So all of these three settings, all these three elements put together make up the exposure of your images. So too dark or too bright in one direction or the other when you take a photo, and you're going to have an unusable image. So the goal is to quickly find the balance between all three of these elements every time we take a photo. So let's walk through a couple examples of how we've used the exposure triangle to create a correct exposure. All right, so this image was taken with a shutter speed of 1/800th of a second. The ISO was 1000, which is pretty high. And the aperture was as large as I could go on this particular lens that I was using at f1.4. So with this particular photo, I knew I wanted to stop or freeze the motion or action taking place in this scene. And I wanted to get the grain frozen in midair. In order to do that, I needed a pretty fast shutter speed. I also knew that I wanted a wide open aperture or a large aperture. This large aperture served two purposes. First, this room was pretty dark, so I needed an aperture that allowed as much light as I could get flooding into the sensor. Second, I wanted a large aperture to achieve that blurred background look, that shallow depth of field that you see. I wanted to separate this girl from her background to put focus on her as the subject. And in order to achieve those goals, a fast shutter speed and a low aperture, or a large aperture to get a shallow depth of field, I had to have a high ISO to get the correct exposure. So you see the ISO sitting there at 1000. This is important to keep in mind. In almost every circumstance, I personally make exposure decisions with my shutter speed and my aperture in mind first. So once I know what shutter speed and aperture I want, then I will change my ISO to get the right exposure. Now, if I start having to push my ISO above 1600, then I'll start having to make decisions based on my ISO first. But once you get past 1600, again, even with the most advanced cameras today, they're going to create a significant amount of noise. So I try to stay below 1600, and I make my exposure decisions based on shutter speed and aperture first, and adjust my ISO accordingly. In this image, we've got a little boy separated from his background with a large aperture. So the aperture sat at 2.8. The scene was relatively cloudy and overcast and nearing sunset. So the light was becoming less and less. So I went with a ISO of 400. And then these two elements put my shutter speed at 1/640th of a second, which is plenty fast enough to freeze motion and an active little boy. And then here we've got a little boy inside a classroom setting. This scene was particularly dark. Again, we were in a dark classroom, so in order to get a relatively fast shutter speed, I had to have my ISO pretty high at 1600. Now at the same time, my aperture is almost all the way open, as large as it can go at f1.6. And this gives that image not only a lot of light in a dark setting, but it gave it a shallow depth of field where the background is blurry and the subject is separated from his background. And the focus for the viewer puts this little boy's eyes and his face as the thing to look at in this photo. And then here we've got a landscape photo from Hawaii. I've got a shutter speed of 1/13th of a second, which is pretty slow, but it's still fast enough to freeze the waves just a little bit in the background. So I've always chosen an aperture that sits right in the middle of the range. Now I could have gone higher on my aperture on this image to ensure that everything in this frame was in focus, but that would have required my shutter speed to be slower, and I wanted to somewhat freeze that motion of the water splashing in the background of this frame. I could have increased my ISO, but I really wanted a clean image that didn't have any noise, which is really good for landscape photos. So I went with an ISO of 100. I wanted an image that didn't have any noise, and I wanted a image that still had some motion blur in the water, in the sand, in the foreground. So if I had increased my ISO, I would have had to have increased my shutter speed, and then there wouldn't have been any motion in the water in that foreground sand area. There were a lot of decisions I had to make in this image to get the exposure and the image that I wanted. So too slow of a shutter speed, and those trees on the left would have started to blur. Too large of an aperture, and not everything in the frame would have been in focus. Too high of an ISO, and this image would have started to get noisy, which is something that you don't want in a landscape photo. And so I had to find a balance that fit all my needs while creating a correct exposure for this image. And this is what I landed on. Okay, now after all of that, it might be incredibly complicated to remember, a bunch of numbers and what does what. But the good news is there's an easy way to cheat the system and to help you get the right exposures without having to memorize all the different scenarios for exposure, shutter speed, and ISO. So our cameras come with a great tool for helping us achieve perfect exposures or close to perfect exposures, and this is called your exposure meter. So if you look through your viewfinder, you're going to see a scale that looks similar to the scale shown here. So your exposure meter can usually be found at the very bottom of your viewfinder. And as you change your shutter speed, your aperture and your ISO to brighter settings, that little ticker on the right or at the bottom will move to the right, and you'll know you have overexposed or your exposure is too bright. As you change your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO to darker settings, the little ticker at the bottom will move to the left, and you'll know you're underexposed and your exposure is too dark. Now, if you don't see the little ticker at all at the bottom, that means you are way over or way underexposed. So you want to make sure that it's somewhere in that range. But the goal of this tool is to get the little ticker to land directly on the 0 mark. If you can do that every single time you take a photo, you will have consistent exposures every single time. Now, sometimes the exposure metering system will make things a little too dark or a little too light, but if your ticker is close to or on the 0, you'll at the very least have a usable image every single time, and you can change the exposure and make adjustments to the brightness in the editing process from there. But try to get that ticker on the 0 every single time, and you're going to have a usable image almost every single time. I use this tool constantly for capturing correct exposures. It's crucial to helping me get the right exposure with consistency. So use this tool, pay attention to this when you're photographing. Make sure you are trying to get that ticker on that 0 mark. Now, you do have another option, and that is to turn your histogram on. Now, the histogram is also going to tell you if your image is correctly exposed, but it does so after the image is taken. So if your image is too dark, the diagram will show peaks on the left side of the diagram in the blacks and shadows section. And if your image is too bright and overexposed, the peaks of the diagram are going to be weighted towards the highlights and whites of the diagram on the right side. You are welcome to use the histogram, but I would recommend against it, and here's why. It's one more thing to worry about. And if you're trusting your camera meter, the slide we just showed you, if you're trusting the exposure meter to correctly expose your images, the exposures of your images are going to be correct. Plus, we live in a digital age, in a digital era. We can more quickly and easily look at the image itself on the back of our camera to determine whether or not it's exposed correctly, rather than trusting a histogram. So I will almost always encourage you to turn your histogram off. As I've said before, our gear and our tools should be an extension of us. Just like a paintbrush is an extension of a painter's hand Your camera gear is an extension of you as a creative tool and as a photographer. And so I want to encourage you to set your gear up so that it gets out of your way as much as possible. So in my opinion, histograms are unnecessary tools. That's just one more thing to distract from the creative process. Now, metering modes are something that I want you to be aware of, but they aren't something that you're gonna change all the time. Now, these modes are what determine the exposure your exposure meter wants you to hit. So as you point your camera at different scenes, your camera will decide where your exposure should be based on what you're pointing the lens at. So I personally only use 2 metering modes, and I rarely switch between the two. It might be important to note that Canon is the only brand of camera that I know of that has 4 metering modes. All other camera brands have 3 metering modes. So don't be alarmed if your camera only has 3. The metering modes I generally use are zone or spot metering. So zone metering will take the entire scene in your viewfinder into consideration when it's giving you an exposure reading. Spot metering will give you an exposure reading based on a single point in your frame. And so on some cameras, this will even move with the focus point. As you move your focus point and select different focus points in your camera, the metering mode, or that spot mode, is going to change with each focus point. So if you want to expose for somebody's face and you want to put the focus point on that face, using spot metering would be a great way to go. We're going to get into moving your focus points in a little bit in the focus section of this course. For starters, though, I would set your metering mode to zone and leave it there. Let your camera meter based on the entire scene that you're looking at, and you're going to get the most consistent results out of that mode. And you won't have to think about or go back and change these settings all that often. All right, let's talk about format. All DSLR or mirrorless camera systems allow you to shoot in either RAW or JPEG. Now, I'm going to encourage you to always shoot in RAW. RAW files are uncompressed files that allow you to make a wider range of edits when you start in your editing process for editing your images. JPEGs are a compressed file, and once the file is compressed, you don't have as much editing space in that file. So RAW not only allows you more editing room in your images, but if you make mistakes in your exposure, then you can recover those mistakes a lot easier from a RAW file. So making edits on JPEG files is difficult. You won't be able to push your editing process as far with a JPEG file. You won't be able to manipulate your photos as much with a JPEG file. So JPEG should be used only after you have edited your RAW file and you're ready to share your image with the world. The goal we are trying to achieve through these courses is better content for ministry headquarters, better storytelling content of what God's doing through your organization. And using a RAW file format will allow you to create content that provides the most potential for ministry headquarters to be able to edit, to be able to use for their marketing purposes. So let's look through a couple images to show the difference between RAW and JPEG. All the examples were taken with RAW, edited in RAW, and then exported to JPEG once I was happy with my editing results. Now quickly, there are some circumstances when you might want to shoot in JPEG. The first is practicing your photography skills and the exposure triangle. There's no need to shoot in RAW if you're simply practicing. RAW files take up way too much space to be used as practice files. So the other time that you might want to shoot in JPEG would be if you don't have editing software that can handle RAW files. But with that said, you're probably going to be sending your files to ministry headquarters for editing anyways. So if that's your primary reason for shooting in JPEG, I would still encourage you to shoot in RAW. Give your ministry the file that and it's going to help them the most. All right, so this first example is a great example of an overexposed image an image that was too bright that I was able to save because I used a raw file. So if I had shot this image with a JPEG format, it would have been unusable, or at least close to unusable, because of how bright and overexposed it was. But because I shot this in RAW, I was able to edit the file into a usable photo, and this was the result, a correctly exposed image. So here's the edited version, compressed to JPEG after I made the edits. You can see from the before and after just how much I was able to edit this photo and bring the exposure down in post-production. And this is only possible because I was using a raw file format. This next example will show how much control you have over your final image. So when raw files are created, they're a pretty flat and colorless image, but they hold a great deal of information that we can work with when we are editing. So they give you the most creative control in your editing process because they hold so much information. So this was the raw file, and this was the file after it had been edited. So here you can see just how much contrast and how much color I was able to add to this image. Now, when your camera creates a JPEG, it still starts with a raw file, but the camera itself does the compression to JPEG. But we don't want to trust our cameras to decide on the contrast and the color editing of our images. We want to have control over that. And shooting in RAW allows for that custom control over our images. Now, because I shot this in RAW, I got to decide how much contrast was applied. I got to decide the color correction for this image. And then I was able to export to JPEG with the image that I wanted to create, rather than trusting my camera to handle the compression and the export of the contrast and color and all the adjustments. So in order to have the most creative control, we want to shoot in RAW. Here's another example of a raw image prior to editing. You'll see in the following slide a big color change between the raw file and the edited JPEG. So in this raw file, the skin tones of these kids are more towards the red side, which is not what we want. And these are more true to the color that was in the scene. So anytime we are photographing people, it's really important to get the color and the skin tones correct, right? So although our cameras are really advanced tools, I never want to trust my camera to make the right color correction decisions when compressing my files. So we need to have the ability to have that control over those elements in our photos. And getting the skin tones correct in this image was really important. So it was nice to have a raw file to use and to work with so I could make the proper edits. Now, we're not going to spend too much time in this course discussing white balance because it's a bit irrelevant unless you are shooting in JPEG. Remember, we just got done talking about the importance of shooting in a RAW format. One of the benefits of shooting in RAW is that a RAW file will save all of these color profiles within the file. So when you go to edit that RAW file, we can switch and change the color profile in the editing process. And this allows us to have one less thing to worry about when we are taking pictures. And it gives us control over the color in our photos. So I will always recommend shooting auto white balance, AWB. That last image of the little girl in the crowd was a perfect example. I shot that image in RAW, and I had the ability to change the color tones and the temperature of the color in that image exactly how I saw the scene in real life. By shooting in RAW, we can avoid one less function to change when we're out in the field. So back to the camera being an extension of ourselves. How can we set our gear up to get out of the way as much as possible? And shooting in auto white balance is one other way that we can simplify the process of creating images. This is one less thing you have to worry about. If you're shooting in RAW, change your white balance to auto white balance and leave it there. If you decide you want to shoot in JPEG, you're going to have to change your white balance because JPEG is going to compress the color. And if you've got the wrong white balance of that for that scene, the color is not going to be correct in that JPEG, and you won't be able to edit it in the editing process as much. If you do decide you want to change the white balance for each scene, the camera industry has standardized the whole white balance selection process and made things pretty simple to understand. If you're shooting in daylight, change the white balance to daylight, that little sun icon. If you're shooting in shade, change the settings to shade. Shooting in a cloudy day, you get the idea. So pretty much change the white balance to the little icon that is closest to the scene that you're shooting in, and you're going to get the correct white balance for that scene. All right. Again, always shoot in auto white balance if you're shooting in RAW. So in our Photography 101 class, I said that the fastest route to better photography is focusing on better compositions. So we spend some considerable time walking through composition and the rule of thirds in that course. So if you'd like to refresh and learn more about composition, I would encourage you to go back and take a look at that course, because we're not going to spend as much time on composition in this course, but we will spend some time on more advanced compositional techniques. So the first and most important thing I want you to think about when you're thinking about compositions is filling the frame. If you can keep this in mind, your photography will greatly increase in quality. Fill the frame, especially in a ministry context where you're primarily photographing people. Now, there are two ways to do this within the context of a ministry photography in the field. Remember, from our basic photo class, we are primarily going to be photographing people. So the first way to fill the frame is with your subject. And the second way is to fill the frame with your subject and their surroundings. So how we decide between the two options is a choice that you're going to have to make in the field. But as a general rule, ask yourself, does the subject's surroundings help me tell this story, or do they distract from the story? If they help tell the story, then include the surroundings. If they distract, then move in close and keep your subjects, or move in close to your subject and remove the surrounding elements from that subject. So don't be afraid to exclude elements in a frame or in a scene and cut things out of your frame. So those elements can often, become distracting pieces in your final photo. So it's okay to move into a scene and remove things from that scene so that you have a greater focus on your subject. But keep that in mind when you're looking at your composure. How can I fill the frame? All right, if you remember back from Photography 101, this is the rule of thirds. This is easily the most recognizable, most common tool used in any discussion around composition. We have got two horizontal lines and two vertical lines running through the image. And the points at which these lines intersect are where you'll want to place your subject, or the most interesting elements in your image. So in most cases, when photographing people, the individual or the subject's eyes will be the most interesting points. So the eyes should generally, in most situations, land on the intersecting points. In this example, we are close enough to the subject that we can fit both of his eyes on two different intersecting points. One important note to remember, eyes are incredibly important in any photograph with a person or individual as the subject. So when a viewer looks at an image, the eyes will always be the first thing the viewer's eyes are drawn towards. The eyes will engage the viewer far better than any other element in a photo. So when photographing people, 99% of the time, you should be focusing on the eyes. That's where the images should be their sharpest. Here we've got a couple of quick examples just showing the rule of thirds in practice. In this first image on the left, I've placed the subject's head close to the upper left intersecting point. The subject is also facing towards that most negative space in that image, so it creates balance and flow within this photo. In the second image of the group of little girls, that group of 4 little girls is, as a whole, our entire subject. So all 4 of those girls are our singular subject. And I've placed those girls' eyes on that upper horizontal line. And then in this last example, I've placed the little boy's eyes on the upper left intersecting point. Now, this composition created a balanced image and gave space for the bike that this boy is leaning on. So our eyes move within this image from left to right and back again because the rule of thirds composition, those rules are being applied to this image. So the balance within this image is it's pleasing to the eye. Our eye flows through this image really well. There's not a lot of distracting elements with this within this frame. And it's what makes the rule of thirds such a powerful compositional tool, because it can help create balance within your frame. Again, I spent some considerable time discussing the rule of thirds in our Photo 101 class, so be sure to check that out. But today I want to spend some time in this course discussing some more advanced compositional techniques. So let's get into those. So the first technique I want to share is the use of negative space. Negative space is empty space within your frame. So our eyes do not like negative space. As an experiment, try to spend some time focusing your eyes in on the blurry backgrounds and the empty space in each of these photos. And if you do that, you'll start to notice that you will experience an unsettled feeling. Your eyes don't like to look at nothingness. Your eyes don't like to look at blurry elements. So if your images are composed completely of negative space, you're going to have a lot of unusable images. But negative space can be a powerful tool for drawing the viewer's attention, or the viewer's eyes, towards our subjects. So since our eyes don't like to view negative space, they will naturally try to avoid and try to find something more pleasing to look at. So negative space is a great tool for drawing attention to your subject and keeping your viewer's attention on that subject. So if you spend some time looking at all these images, you'll start to notice that you don't want to take your eyes off of these subjects' eyes. That's because there isn't anything else to look at in these photos. Everything outside of these subjects, everything outside of their eyes and their faces is negative space. And our eyes can't help but stare into the eyes of these subjects, right? So, because if, as a viewer, we take our eyes off of the subject, we land on negative space and blurry elements. With images like this, the story is really simple. These individuals have worth, they have dignity, they are beautiful, they are important. There isn't any other story taking place in these photos because there are not other elements except negative space to look at. So the viewer gets drawn into an image like these, and it's hard to look away. It's hard to not be engaged with a photo like this, because everything in this image points our eye as the viewer back to the eyes of the subject. All right, so let's walk through a few of these images in greater detail. In this first image, we have a little boy with his hands over his head. So the negative space is the white wall in the background, right? And even his white shirt serves as a bit of negative space. So the background is so blurred that our eyes won't have interest in looking at that portion of the image, and they're naturally drawn towards this little boy's eyes. There's nothing in this image to distract from the viewer being engaged with and looking at this little boy's eyes. In the second image, we have a rickshaw driver sitting in his rickshaw. So the rickshaw canopy serves as the background and the negative space in this image. And although the rickshaw canopy isn't blurred out completely in the background, it is a blank slate with nothing to see, right? There's nothing to see about that canopy. So our eyes might glance at it, but they'll always come back to looking at this man's eyes and his face. And then lastly, we've got this little boy photographed at sunrise in front of a stucco wall. So the stucco wall is blurred in the background. And even though the light on that wall is a really beautiful orange color, our eyes don't want to spend much time looking at it because it's blurry, and our eye quickly comes back to looking at this boy or our subject in this photo. So all three of these images are great examples of the use of negative space. And so if employed properly, it can serve to bring your viewer's focus back onto your subject. The next technique we're going to discuss is leading lines. Using leading lines to draw your viewer's eye into the frame or draw your viewer to your subject is a great tool for creating depth in your photography. Leading lines will help give your images a three-dimensional feel. So obviously images, right, they're two-dimensional, but leading lines will help create the feeling of depth beyond 2 dimensions. So in these examples, we have various degrees of leading lines. Some are more obvious than others. As you look for images in the scenes in the field where you're working, pay close attention to the lines that naturally exist around you and see if you can't use those lines to draw the viewer into your frame. Let's look at a couple examples closer. So in this first example, we've got a little girl sitting at her desk. In this example, the desk serves as the leading line, or the primary leading line at least. The lines that are made up of her desk draw the viewer into the frame. They create depth. There are also some drawers in the background behind the girls and behind their heads. Those also serve as subtle leading lines. And the angles at which this image was taken does a lot of the leading line work. So it's easy to photograph and get into the habit of photographing everything straight on, but approaching scenes from an angle will often present opportunities to use leading lines in your images. So the desks in this photo draw our attention into this image and create some of the depth. This next example is the most obvious of all the examples of the use of leading lines. The concrete curbs serve as the leading lines in this image, and they draw the viewer's eyes directly to the subject in this photo. And then lastly, we've got the most subtle example of the bunch. The handle of this grub hoe in this image serves as the leading line, and it draws our attention onto our subject. So leading lines can show up and be used in really unique ways like this. Just like in this scenario, right? So keep an eye out for natural or man-made lines that draw the viewer into the frame. And then the last advanced compositional technique that we'll discuss is natural framing. Natural framing is when we find an element within the scene that frames your subject. So natural framing is going to surround your subject in a line or a group of lines that will continually serve to bring your viewer's eye back to the subject. So remember from our negative space slide, our eyes want to wander throughout an image. So if we can find elements that bring our viewer's eyes back to the subject, we are going to create better, more engaging images. Now, it's important to note that this technique is going to be far more effective if the lines that are created by the natural frame don't fall behind your subject. So for example, if the roof line of the image on the top left of this slide was lower and it fell behind the girl in the red shirt or dress's head, this technique would not have been as effective for this image. So let's look at some examples. So this first example is really subtle, but notice how the bright light on the wall in the background frames the subject. When our eyes leave the subject to explore the rest of the photo, these bright lines that frame the subject push our eyes back to the subject. In this next example, our subject is naturally framed by the building behind her. The lines of this brick building envelop and surround the subject and draw our eyes back to the subject. And then lastly, we've got the girl using the grub hoe again. In this image, not only do we have the leading line of the hoe handle, or this tool handle, but we also have the banana tree serving as a natural frame around our subject. So the trunk of the tree rises up alongside our subject, and the banana leaf arches over our subject, creating a partial arch around the subject and a natural frame around this girl, which is our subject. In our Photography 101 course, we spent some time discussing how to create depth within an image using focus. And this course, I'm going to spend time discussing focus from a more technical perspective as it relates to DSLR and mirrorless camera systems. So the first thing I want you to do is set your camera up for back button focus. Most DSLRs will have a back button focus button. Some mirrorless cameras have an FN button. That's a function button, and that can be programmed to function as a back button focus. More often than not, or most often than not, you're going to see an AF on button on the back of the camera. So whatever the case is within your given gear, I'm going to take some time to demonstrate why back button focus is so important. Okay, let's talk about back button focus. As the diagram just showed, back button focus is going to land right here on most cameras. Sometimes it's going to say AF on or autofocus on. Sometimes it'll just be a FN number, a function button that you need to change to a back button focus in your settings. But the reason why back button focus is so important is oftentimes your subject is going to land in an area in your composition that doesn't land on a focus point. When that happens, we have to focus the camera and then recompose. We have to focus and then recompose the shot to the composition that we want. And to avoid that, we can use back button focus. Rather than focusing, recomposing, shooting, focusing, recomposing, shooting, using the half press of a shutter to focus, we can focus on that subject with our back button focus, recompose, and then shoot again, and shoot as many times as we want, as long as we are holding down on that back button focus. So this allows us to take a lot more images holding the focus on our subject without having to focus, recompose, and shoot, focus, recompose, and shoot, and do that continuously on repeat. It allows us to hold the focus where we want it and avoid the movement of the camera and all of that repeating nonsense. So back button focus is a great tool to use. Start switching your cameras over to that and getting used to that, and that's going to be take your skills in photography to a whole nother level. Now, another great tool that I highly encourage you to use is focus selection. So most DSLR and mirrorless cameras should have multiple focus points. The benefit of using your focus points is that you don't have to focus and recompose your shot as much. So remember, when you're photographing people, your focus point is almost always going to be the subject's eyes. But what if that subject's eyes are not in the center of the frame? Many photographers will focus on the eyes with the center focus point, and then while holding focus by pushing the shutter button halfway down, they will recompose or move the camera to get the composition they want. Now, a more effective and efficient way of doing this is to move your focus point closest to where you want to focus within the composition you're trying to create. So you'll notice I just moved on this slide the focus point to the top right. I could also move it to the top left. Any of these points you see on this slide could be a focus point. So we want to move the focus point closest to our subject's eyes in the frame that allows us to create the composition that we want. So here's an example. Let's use this photo as an example. If I had used the center focus button for this image, the focus would have been on this subject's shirt rather than his eyes. Or I would have had to have focused on his eyes and then recomposed to get the correct exposure or correct composition. Instead, I moved my focus point over to the subject's eye, and I was able to focus and snap the image with the composition I wanted, all without moving the camera. This may not seem like a big deal, but when you're photographing motion or you're photographing action and you need to snap a photo at the exact perfect time with the correct exposure and the correct composition without missing the movement or the action that's happening in front of you, you cannot afford to focus and then recompose your image every single time. You're likely going to miss the action or the most opportune time for that photo, or that photo, the action is going to be outside of the frame and your subject won't be in focus. So moving your focus point to where you want it to be focused so that you can compose your image the way you want is best, especially when you're photographing action and motion. All right, let's talk about perspective. I spent a little time on this in our Photo 101 class or course, but I think it's important to reiterate, especially in the context of ministry photography and storytelling at an advanced level. So if you've ever had the chance to watch a photographer in action, you might have noticed that they put themselves in seemingly odd positions as they photograph. So as you learn to take better photos, I'm going to encourage you to play with different perspectives. And in order to do that, you might be required to get into low or squatting positions, possibly even laying on the ground. Play around with different angles and perspectives. Put your camera at different angles and perspectives. Don't just stand up straight and take an image from a normal standing perspective. Our eyes are used to seeing the world from a standing point of view. So when you get into a low or a high perspective and you change up this perspective that you normally see the world, it makes for images that are unique to how we usually view the world. Especially if you're photographing a child or children, you're going to want to get down low and at their level. Don't just shoot down on them. If you do that, the images that you create will are going to make the viewer seem as though they are looking down on the subjects. And that is not what we want to achieve in our storytelling, especially in the context of a ministry setting. So here are a couple examples of different angles and perspectives. This first image was taken at eye level. I'm a pretty tall person, so it often means that I am squatting a lot to get at this level with my subjects, especially when I'm photographing kids. An eye level perspective, it puts the viewer on the same level as the subject. It's an incredibly powerful perspective to shoot from, specifically for ministry storytelling, because it is a perspective that can break down barriers. Now, this perspective mimics how we see people in real life. So you can make the subject more relatable to your audience by photographing them from an eye level perspective. The second shot is a high angle shot. The camera angle in this particular shot is subtle, but the camera is looking down on the subject. In ministry, we need to be careful with this type of shot or this type of angle. And we can portray vulnerability with this angle, which can be powerful. But this high angle can also portray inferiority or give the viewer the feeling that they are looking down on the subject. And this particular image works well because of this little boy's smile. His smile gives us the feeling as the viewer that we're not looking down on him and that he's not to be pitied in any way. If this boy had not been smiling, this image might not be usable. So please make sure to keep in mind how you are portraying the people you are photographing. It's important that we don't do harm or do more harm than good in our storytelling, and making your subject inferior does harm. Now, this third image uses a low perspective. Low angle perspectives are great for giving the subject a sense of power. So Rahel here is our subject, She said that she wanted to be an architect when she grows up. So in telling her story, we wanted to use a camera angle that placed her in a position of power, one that placed her in a position to achieve her dreams. And so this low angle perspective where we're looking up at Rahel gives the viewer the feeling that Rahel is in control of her dreams. And then this last shot is another great example of an eye level perspective. So technically, when I shot this image, the camera was at about hip or chest level with these kids. So slightly looking up at them, but really it's at eye level because these kids are all at different heights. So the perspective for this photo balances on that eye level. Again, giving that the feeling for the viewer that we are on the same level as these kids. But in particular, this shot serves to give the viewer the feeling that we are running right alongside these kids. So this perspective is paired with the movement and the action in this scene, and it draws the viewer in and makes us feel a part of the action. So don't ever be afraid to place the camera right in the middle of the action. It helps give the viewer the feeling that they are there with the subject, or in this case, that we are there with these kids. Remember, when we're storytelling, when we're creating content, part of our job when we are storytelling is to make our beneficiaries relatable. Across the globe, every kid in every nation from every language group has raced their friends in the streets, right? This is an incredibly relatable image because we've all experienced this in our own childhoods. It's important that we find ways to relate our subject to our audience, and changing your perspective and the position of the camera in relation to the subject can help achieve those goals. So earlier in this course, we discussed aperture and how a large aperture can create a shallow depth of field, as shown in a lot of the images that we've looked at today, right? So shallow depth of field, or as it's often referred to as that blurry background look, is achieved primarily by using a large aperture. Earlier, when we discussed large apertures, I said that large aperture lenses tend to be more expensive, but that there were ways to achieve this look without the use of expensive lenses. So if you don't have access to expensive lenses, here's where we're going to talk about how we can create some of that blurry background look without super expensive gear. Now, the first way to achieve this look is by using a zoom lens, while at the same time making sure that your subject is a good distance away from the background. Now, the background won't be as blurry as it might if you have a very large aperture lens, but you can achieve this look using a zoom and as low of an aperture or as large of an aperture as your lens allows. Just make sure that you're separating your subject from the background by a good distance. And then another way to achieve this look is to make sure that your camera and your lens are close to your subject, as seen in this second option down on the bottom. Again, you want to make sure in this scenario that your subject is removed from the background. The farther your subject is from the background, the more intense the blurry background look will be. So the proximity of your lens to your subject and the lens to the background will have a significant effect on this shallow depth of field effect. So the further you can remove your subject from the background, the more depth of field you're going to be able to create. So these are two ways that you can create shallow depth of field images without the use of really expensive lenses. So play around with your camera's proximity or position to your subject and your background, or in relation to your background, and you'll start to see how you can create shallow depth of field without expensive lenses. Again, shallow depth of field can be a powerful tool in isolating your subject from your background. So so that we can keep our viewers' attention and make sure that it remains on our subject. So this is a great skill to familiarize yourself with and get accustomed to. All right, so let's discuss light and understanding light, how to see light, how to use light, what to look for when searching for good or great light is what separates good images from great images. So great light or the proper use of light will take your images to the next level. Light is what makes photography possible. I'm going to spend a moment discussing the types of light you'll encounter in the field, and then we'll discuss how we can position ourselves in relation to the sun in order to get various and differing results with our light. So we went over this slide in Photography 101, but I think it's important to revisit this slide as a refresher. So you might remember there are different types of light and qualities of light. Different times during the day or different weather conditions are going to determine what quality of light you are working with and what quality of light you have access to. So there are three types of or qualities of light that you need to look out for in the context of ministry photography in the field: hard light, soft light, and diffused light. First, I want to discuss hard light. Hard light is generally what we find on sunny days when we're outside, and particularly in the middle of the day. So this type of light is the most harsh and the most difficult to work with for photographers. It can still be used to create great images. It's just more difficult to work with and to manipulate. So hard light generally produces images with a lot of contrast. And that's why it can still be used to create great images, because contrast is important. You'll notice in this image on the left, this boy, his name's Ian, he's looking up towards the sun. Because the angle of his face is directed towards the sun, this is creating even light across his face. So if he had been looking straight at my camera during this scene, then there would have been dark shadows that would have covered his eye sockets, and that's what makes hard light images really unappealing. We want to avoid casting hard shadows in the eyes. It makes it difficult for the viewer to see the eyes, and again, I've said this multiple times. We want the eyes to be in focus. We want the eyes to be visible in our images when we're photographing people, because the eyes are the most important element in your image in creating a connection between your viewer and the subject. So that's why harsh light is so hard, because it casts shadows in the eyes to where you can't see the eyes. Next, we've got soft light. Notice that the light is much more flat. Soft light is the easiest to work with because the light across your entire image is consistent, but it's also the least dynamic. So photographers love soft light because you don't have to worry about hard shadows covering the eyes when you're photographing your subject in soft light. Soft light can be found in shade. So in general, if you're shooting during the middle hours of the day, you're going to want to look for shade rather than hard light scenarios in the harsh sun. Soft light can also be found during overcast days. Overcast days will create a soft and flat light that's really easy to photograph in. So anywhere you point your camera is going to have consistent and even lighting. So overcast days are great days to photograph in. And then the last type or quality of light we'll discuss is diffused light. Diffused light is the most dynamic and interesting light to use in photography. So diffused light is simply hard light that has passed through some obstruction. So for example, in this image of the girl in class, the light has passed through a window. Window light indoors is great light to work with. So that window is serving as a diffused element or diffusion. So anytime you're taking pictures indoors, look for a window. It's going to serve as a great source of diffused light. Now, diffused light can come in many shapes and forms when photographing outside. Clouds can serve as diffusion. Bright but overcast days are a form of diffusion. The light you see during the hour after sunrise and the hour before sunset create some of the best diffused light situations that exist outside. These two times are called the golden hour. So even when there are no clouds, sunrise and sunset, especially the hour after sunrise and the hour before sunset, is diffused light because the sun's light is passing through the Earth's atmosphere. That's what gives it the beautiful golden color. The light is diffused and it's spread out by passing through all of the elements and particles that exist within our atmosphere. So all of the smog, all the pollution, the light passes through all of those particles and gets diffused and broken up, and it creates that beautiful orange color that you see. So this first example is an example of hard light. The sun is bright and in the sky. Now, this is later in the day, so even though it's direct sunlight, it still works pretty well. But you can see that this man's eyes are in shadows and they're difficult to see. The second image is soft light because it was an overcast day. Notice that the light across the scene is consistent and it's even. There aren't any harsh bright spots or shadows that are too dark. The consistency across the scene is evident in this image. So no matter where I would have photographed this man from in this scene, because it was overcast, the lighting would have been pretty much the same. And then lastly, we've got an example of diffused light. So this image was taken during sunrise. Now, I love this image, but there are a lot of things I could have done better. I use this example of golden hour light to show you how beautiful golden light looks, even though the image has plenty of flaws. So even though there were a bunch of technical mistakes made in this image, the light is so beautiful that the image still works really well. So great light can save images that maybe weren't technically executed well. Now, that's all the light discussions we had last time in Photography 101. Today, this is what we're going to talk about, more advanced lighting techniques. So I'm going to take our discussion on light a little further and share what we can look for in the field. So in photography, the direction of the light plays a really important role in the final image. So where you place your camera and yourself in relation to your light source and your subject will create a wide variety of results. So it's important to note that in all of these examples, our primary light source is the sun. Especially in your ministry context, you're going to be primarily using the sun as your light source. You're unlikely to be photographing with artificial light sources like strobe lights. So we're not going to spend any time discussing those artificial light sources. So this first diagram represents front light. Front light is when your primary light source, in this case the sun, is facing or falling on the front of your subject. So this means that the sun is behind you as the photographer. So let's look at some examples of front light in use. In this first example, we've got front light on our subject, the shepherd. The sun was directly behind me, shining on this scene, and the result is a well-lit image. There's nothing overly dynamic about the light in the scene, but it's still a great image because of the action, the movement, the composition, and consistent lighting, because I used front lighting for this photo. Now, this second image is an example of front light a little later in the day. So notice how the light is a much prettier color in this scene. The fall off of the bright points or the highlights, the fall off from the highlights to the shadows is a lot more gradual. It's a lot more pleasing to the eye. This is front light, but it's also diffused front light because this was shot close to sunset. The light is passing through the atmosphere, creating the really pretty orange hues and tones. Now, it's also important to note that the sun isn't directly behind me in this scene. Notice how the boy's shadow casts on the wall. So the sun is behind me, creating front light, but it's at a slight angle. So when you're playing with front light, play with the position of your subject in relation to that front light to get varying results. You'll be able to create more dynamic images like this one by shooting your subject at different angles. And this could be argued that this is verging on and getting close to side light, which we'll talk about in a little bit. but the sun was enough behind me to still consider this front light. And this last example is another example of front light taking place later in the day, close to sunset. There's nice contrast between the highlights and the shadows in this scene. The light isn't too bright that it's too harsh because this was taken later in the day. So ultimately, it's a nice, well-lit image because I've used front light that falls or fills the entire scene without being overly bright or overexposing anything. This is a fun, bright image that's coupled with this boy's smile, so it evokes a positive emotion in the viewer. But this is an example of front light. The sun was directly behind me, shining on my subject. Now on this next diagram, we are depicting backlight. So as the name suggests, backlight is when your light source is behind your subject. So backlight can create some stunning and dynamic results. But it's important to note that cameras, no matter how nice of a camera you have, struggle with focus when creating a backlit image. So the sun is shining into the lens, and that makes it hard for your camera to focus. So I will oftentimes shoot backlit images from either the cover of shade, or I'll use my hand to cover the sun. Then I'll focus with my back button focus, and then I will remove my hand and you will get a good shot. You can also use your subject to block the sun as well, just depending on how high the sun is in the sky. Backlit images can also create really cool lens flares in your images, which can be beautiful and add another level of depth to your images. So just be careful that the sun flares aren't so overpowering that they take away from your subject or distract from your subject. So let's look at some of the examples I've got of backlight. So in this first example, we've got a group of girls walking to school. Notice the small sun flare just behind the tallest girl's ear. It's really tiny and really subtle, but it is there. Backlit images also create a beautiful rim light that wraps around your subject. So you can see an outline of bright white light that wraps around these girls' arms and around their hair. Notice that our subjects are a little darker in this image, especially in the where their dark skirts are. When you're using backlit or backlight to capture an image, take note that you're gonna lose some of the details in your subjects. So you have to be okay with that. It can still create beautiful results and really dynamic images, but you will lose details in the shadows if you are backlighting your images. And then this second example, we've got Rahel. She is walking to school with her siblings and her friends. This entire scene is backlit, but most of the scene takes place within shade. So if you look close, you can see hard light falling on the older woman's head and her head covering, and on the head of the boy in the red on the right. So our light source is backlight, but our subject and most of the action taking place in this image takes place in the shade. So this is a great example of mixed light qualities. The result is consistent light on our subject from the shade, but a dynamic image with a lot of contrast because there is hard light elements within the scene. So additionally, because our subject is in the shade, I was able to overexpose this image to make it brighter in order to retain some of the detail in our subject, which is generally, again, difficult to do when you're using or shooting a backlit image. And then lastly, we've got this little boy standing in the street with the sun behind him. There is a lot of contrast between shadows and highlights in this image, which makes for a dynamic and interesting scene, but it did take a good amount of editing in order to make this boy a strong visual element in this scene. I had to spot expose this boy's face, or I had to make this boy's face brighter with editing software so that you could see his face. If I had not done that, his face was too dark and you wouldn't have been able to see him or his eyes very well. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're backlighting images. My last point in regards to backlight If you're taking this course and you are using a mobile device, feel free to play around with backlight, but I don't want you to get discouraged if your results aren't turning out as you had hoped. Mobile device cameras have a very hard time with backlit images. Make sure you are shooting in RAW and underexpose your images, and then edit them in post-production and bring the exposure up with software. And that's how you're going to get the best results with a mobile device. Mobile devices tend to want to overexpose and make things too bright when they're shooting in backlit scenes. So much of the bright spots or bright parts in the image become so bright that they're no longer usable. So if you're using a mobile device, just keep that in mind. Backlit is difficult to shoot with mobile devices. I would recommend shoot it darker, underexpose it, shoot it in RAW, and then edit it and make it brighter in post-production. All right, the last direction of light we're going to discuss is side light. So side light is when your light sources sits on either side of your subject. So side light arguably requires the most manipulation and movement on the photographer's part in order to get the right results. But with that said, I think it can create some of the most dynamically lit images. So side light creates really interesting contrast between light and shadow in your scene, but you'll have to be hyper aware of how the light is falling on your subject and specifically how the light is falling on their face. So if done right, side light can be beautiful. If done poorly, it can ruin your images. Now, there are a few variations to side light or a few results that you can accomplish that are all variations coined and used by painters. So all of these variations are in relation to how the light falls on your subject's face specifically. The first is split light. Split light is when your subject's face is cut directly in half by light and shadow. The second is called Rembrandt lighting. Rembrandt is similar to split light, except with Rembrandt lighting, a small portion of the light bleeds onto the shadow side of the subject's face and creates a small triangle of light on the shadow side of the face. And then lastly, you've got loop light. Loop light happens when your subject's face is almost completely lit, but your subject's nose casts a small shadow onto a bright side of the cheek, and it's ever so slight. Well, with loop light, the light source, or the sun in your context, is placed at a 45-degree angle from the subject. The entire face is almost completely lit except for the nose shadow that is created by that 45-degree angle, and a distinguishing shadow that falls off the subject's face right around the subject's cheek, so opposite of the sun or opposite of the light source. It's the most easily accessible style to achieve loop light, and it creates a beautiful light on the subject. So let's look at some examples of side light. And this slide just kind of shows how you can have the sun at a 45-degree angle to your subject. All right, so this first example is a great example of split light. You can see that our subject is split right down the middle, and the right side is highlights, or the left side of this girl's face is highlights, and the right side of her face is in shadow. This style of lighting is beautiful, but it also can be a bit gritty and moody. So be careful with split lighting. It might end up creating a darker or moodier image than what you're trying to portray. So you just have to keep that in mind when you're using split light. In this next example, we've got side light that almost could be considered reverse loop light. So technically speaking, this image doesn't follow any particular type of lighting. I mean, this could even be close to being considered backlight. From a technical standpoint, this is a pretty poorly executed image, but I didn't have the option to move and adjust my position relative to the light. So I had to shoot with what I had in front of me. This is a great example of how we can still create beautiful images even if we don't follow all the rules technically perfect. This is a great example also of filling the frame. So the reason this image is works so well, even though the lighting isn't technically perfect, is because you've got beautiful colors, engaging faces on from these kids, and a composition that fills the frame. So this image is one of my favorite images that I've ever taken, and yet the style of light that falls on this girl's face doesn't fit into any traditional rules. And I use this example just to demonstrate again that you can make a ton of mistakes in photography and still create beautiful images. So in this third example, we've got another example of split light. Both our primary subject, which is this woman, and our secondary subject, the ox, they are cut down the middle between shadow and light. So there's an even amount of shadow and an even amount of light landing on our subjects to balance out and create depth in this image with this style of lighting. This example is another example of split light. Notice how this girl's face is split down the middle between highlights and shadows. One side of her face is in the shadows, her left side, and her right side is in shadow, or her left side is in highlight, her right side is in shadow. This is a great example of split light. And then lastly, we've got an example of Rembrandt lighting. Notice that the left side of this girl's face is completely lit, while the right side has a small triangle of light that lands just on her cheek. It bleeds over from the highlight side of her face onto the shadow side of her face and creates that little triangle of light. So Rembrandt lighting is split lighting that has a triangle of light that creeps over to the shadow side of the face. Now, after looking at all these examples and discussing the various styles of light, it might be easy to either get overwhelmed or start thinking too much about how the light falls onto your subject's face. In most cases, in a ministry setting, creating images in the field, I don't have a ton of say in how the light lands on my subjects. What I want you to take away from this portion of the course is to be aware of the types and the styles of light so that you can begin seeing and paying attention to how light works in the field. Documentary style photography doesn't give much leeway to controlling the light in any given scene. But I do want you to be aware of all these lighting techniques and styles and these qualities of light so that you can position yourself in the best position possible to create the most dynamic images possible. So as you start to pay attention to light, as you start to see different styles and types and qualities of light, you'll notice scenes that are engaging and dynamic, and the images you're going to come away with will have a greater impact because you have an understanding of where and how light falls, what times of day is going to be the best light. So it's okay to not, I don't want you to be overwhelmed by all of this. I want it to be a tool that can be used to help you start seeing the world from these perspectives. And then lastly, and I shared this slide in our Photography 101 course, but I want you to shoot as many images as possible. Shoot. Take as many images as you can. Get out there, fill up your memory cards. The beauty about digital photography is that we don't run out of film. We can take as many images as we like. And so your skills as a photographer can be honed very quickly if you put in some time into the craft. Great photographers are made simply by taking a lot of photos. We can walk through all the techniques and the skills and the strategies all we want, but at the end of the day, how you become a great photographer is by taking a lot of images. The more images you take, the more you'll begin to see great image without taking the camera to your eye. And more than any course we can teach you, taking a lot of photos is always going to be the best training that you can get. And then Just like in our Photography 101 course, I want to spend some time walking through your images with you guys. Take a bunch of images in the field, and I will critique those images live with you. This is a great way of honing and developing your skills. We can take your images and we can walk through them together. We can walk through what went right, what went wrong, and we can learn from them moving forward. So you can schedule a live critique or a live consultation directly from our website. Just go to the courses page or the page dedicated to this course, and there will be an option to schedule a consultation. Please feel free to take advantage of this offering, as I think it will make a big difference in the development of your photography skills. And that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn advanced photography with us at Reliant. Please don't hesitate to ask if you have any questions. This is our ministry. This is the way we are using our skills, our talents, our abilities for the kingdom. So please grant us the opportunity to pour into you as ministry leaders, as ministry partners, as missionaries in the field, on the grounds, on the front lines of the Great Commission. We want to pour into you an ability to storytell well what God is doing around the world, so that we can get the church inspired to action and mobilize the church around what God is doing and what he is doing through you guys specifically on the front lines. So please grant us the opportunity to come alongside you, raise you up to be good storytellers, so we can have greater kingdom impact with what you guys are doing. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking this course, and please feel free to reach out.